Hello? Marvellous. Right, ready to start. Hello and welcome everybody to this session on finance and the media, why no one trusts it, and why no one trusts either, and what, if anything, can be done about it. Here to discuss this topic, and I am very glad that you're all here because this is a very busy slot in the IFJ calendar. So I'm really glad that the people here are obviously really keen to discuss this, and we will leave some time for questions at the end. Trust in all institutions has eroded with the coming of the internet. But since the 2008 financial crash, in particular, trust in the markets and in those who write about it is at an all-time low. Here to discuss this with me is an illustrious panel. John Authers, to my right, is now the senior markets editor at Bloomberg. And before that, he spent nearly 30 years with the Financial Times, writing about all major markets, from New York, Mexico, and London. And we're going to talk about a piece he wrote for the FT on this very issue. To his right is Tom Standage, who's the deputy editor of The Economist, has also been there for many years. Had started, it's actually written 6 books, all nearly about things to do with the internet, the culture and technology, about our current climate. At the end there, Vivian Schiller needs no introducing for many of you who come to the International Festival of Journalism every year. A doyen of many of the, I don't like to see myself suddenly reflected up. I like the form a lot better. A doyen of many issues of trust, journalism and what matters. She's been former president CEO of NPR, head of news at Twitter, also worked at NBC, and she is currently leading Civil foundation that is dealing with these sorts of issues and how we can fund quality, sustainable journalism across the globe. So, with no further ado, I would like to ask John first, and then this is going to be a debate, as I say, with everybody has strong views on this panel. I am losing my voice, as you might be able to tell, so thank God I've got such a great panel. John wrote a piece about 30 years as a financial journalist and some of the issues that he had discovered. And he called it Finance and the Media and the Catastrophic Crisis in Trust. So I'd like to ask John, why is this catastrophe happening?
Right. Why is this catastrophe? Well, I spent several thousand words explaining that in my big swan song for the FT once I decided I was, with great difficulty, I was going to try life somewhere else. I'll go back to the beginning. I do actually think when I started at the Financial Times, which was in 1990, trust, if anything, in journalism, or in financial journalism at any rate, was excessive. And I think probably the same would have been true of the Wall Street Journal in the States, which had a similar journal of record role. I once actually had a letter from a reader. Feedback from readers used to come in actual letters on paper, which had been written on with ink from fountain pens. That's quite startling in itself. Who had spotted a minor error and ended by saying, "The FT can't be wrong, can you?" And I thought this was snark and thought I would try phoning the guy directly just to soothe the waters, and discovered that no, he wasn't being sarcastic. It had honestly not occurred to him that the Financial Times was capable of getting anything wrong. We're made 100% by humans, but for some reason it still didn't occur to him that the FT was capable of making a mistake. So if anything, we were, the level of trust in financial journalism at that point was excessive. We were taken as providing a bedrock of information that everybody would trust and would use as the basis for their working days in markets and banking and so on. Particularly the Lex column, which at that point only existed in paper form. 300 words, anonymous, basically like tablets coming down from Mount Sinai. You followed them. Everybody in the City of London, every trainee would be told they had to read the Lex column before they arrived at their desk in the morning. Now, as time went by, we all know the story. Particularly in the case of financial journalism, we lost a huge amount of very easy, steady advertising. We used to get paid to publish share prices. That no longer happens. Tombstone advertising, where companies would advertise deals that they had just pulled off, similarly ceased to be any kind of a source of income for us. And then, obviously, things get particularly tough when, back more recently, when you have the rise of Google, AdSense, Craigslist, and so on. So the advertising part of the model came under great attack. Also, could you be a little quieter, please? Thanks. I think the acoustics are very, very good in this room. What you also found, though, was that you saw a steady loss of trust, which came first through the big series of bubbles that expanded and then burst, and particularly when you get to the moment of the financial crisis, when more or less everybody who was seen as any part of the status quo of the establishment came under pressure, came into question. I think what we have now reached is a point where, if at one point we were excessively trusted for writing from the point of view of the Financial Times, I think things may similarly be true of Bloomberg. I believe they're similarly true of the Journal. The FT is where I've spent most of my career. It's now almost become the fact that things are regarded as suspect because it's the financial media that have written it. Traditional journalism is in itself regarded as a suspicious way to process and relay information. Now, obviously, part of this, we all know, is the Brexit and Trump phenomenon. These are big issues which left people...
we won't go try not to mention Brexit.
Okay, sorry. Okay, sorry about that. That thing that's going on back home in England, and that guy who's in charge of things back where I live in the States. Both of those issues had the big problem of exposing people on one side or the other. Again, particularly in the case of my old, wonderful, distinguished employers, the fact that we were as enthusiastic as we were about staying in the EU meant that anything at all we said that impinged in any way on the EU would be treated with distrust. Similarly, there are similar issues that came up with the Trump phenomenon in the US. This is part of a general breakdown of trust in society, which particularly took in the financial media. But there's more to it than that. There's also the problem of adapting and working out how to operate in the modern online world, where people expect a different degree of interaction. Now, just briefly, I'd mentioned my travails on the Lex column, which 20 years after I joined the paper, I had the poisoned chalice of trying to edit the Lex column. 300 words that have been finely chiseled over a day and just sit there on paper like Holy Writ has a certain appeal. It doesn't work at all in an online environment. If it's online, people expect to be able to respond to it, to interact. Lex is anonymous. Lex is this disembodied figure. Lex can't get into arguments or Twitter fights. Any attempt we made, I found, to make Lex steadily more interactive tended instead to bring us down to the level of everybody else who was enjoying themselves hurling abuse at each other in social media, which strangely is what people like doing in social media.
That seems like a perfect point to bring in Tom, given that obviously you've been a long time at The Economist, Tom. Always seen it was such a badge of honour, The Economist, that a member of the royal family would simply be seen with it tucked under her arm to be given instant intellectual kudos. But obviously none of it is actually bylined. We don't know who writes each individual. Have you found that in terms of engagement, in terms of trust, there's been a sort of diminution?
Yeah, so trust is central to our model because we're anonymous, and also because essentially what we sell is a filter on the news that you trust. So the proposition we make to readers is, give us your money and we will save you time. And they are generally readers who have plenty of money and not enough time. So that is a deal they will take, and we filter the news for them and tell them what's going on, and so that only works if they trust us to A, get it right in the reporting of the stories that we choose, and B, choose the right stories. So trust is central to our model. So we do monitor how our brand is perceived, and I remember one of the things, and we do this every couple of years, we do a brand perception survey, and after the global financial crisis, our brand took a hit. Now, we don't know whether that's because we're called The Economist and economists in general were generally come on, why did you not see this coming? You're useless. Obviously, another difficulty is that people who don't know our brand very well assume that we write about nothing but finance and economics. And in fact, we only have 6 pages of finance and economics a week in 66 pages of journalism. So it's 10%, 9% of our output. Most of what we write is actually politics. But I think there was a perception that we're read by the sorts of people who have just blown up the world economy, and therefore we're partly to blame. So very much we do keep an eye on that, and we were tarred to some extent with that brush that we were the in-house journal of the people who just made everything go wrong, and so we bore some of the blame. Now, I think I very much like to look at things through the lens of history, and if you look at the history of trust in media, when the printing press is first invented, the printers realised that if you haven't got much to do, a good way to make some money is you find an old story about a disaster that's happened or a strange-looking creature that's been seen somewhere, and you get it out and you essentially typeset it, and you change the location and change the date, and then you print it when you've got nothing else to do, and people will buy this because people would buy these sort of pamphlets of or a murder trial. That was always a good one, preferably with a really gory description of the execution at the end. And this was the kind of thing that people would do, and the printers at the time used the same sort of defense that the big internet platforms use today, which is we're not responsible for whether this is true or not. This is just something that we heard, and people want to read it. That's up to them, and we're just the middleman, and all this kind of stuff. And the problem when newspapers came along was that newspapers had names, they had a brand, they came out regularly. You wanted people to buy your newspaper again, and so if you let them down, then they would be less likely to do that. So suddenly there was this built-in mechanism where, and if you look at early newspapers, they do print a lot of old rubbish. And the New York Sun famously publishes this story, The Great Moon Hoax, where it talks about John Herschel, the astronomer, finding aliens on the moon. And this was absolutely fantastic for their circulation. And they became the best-selling newspaper in the world pretty much overnight as a result of it. But ultimately, it was not good for their long-term credibility, and they, like everybody else, realised that actually the way you can reliably shift copies was to do true crime stories. And it's great to see true crime has can really come back as a genre in podcasting recently. But the main thing was there was a mechanism whereby the brand of the newspaper and wanting people to come back and buy your newspaper again imposed some sort of constraint on how wrong you could be. And the problem one of the problems that's happened with the internet is that it's blown up that bundle. And now when you see a link that says Hillary Clinton sold uranium to whoever she was supposed to have sold uranium to, and you click on it, and it takes you to this thing that kind of looks like a website, but is actually some trolley content farm produced by the Russians or whatever. You no longer have that bundle, and you're just seeing these stories in isolation. And what that means is we need new mechanisms to propagate trust in the digital era. And so, there are various attempts to do this, and Vivian will tell us about one of them in a minute. But I mean, one of the ones we're involved in is the Trust Project. And the Trust Project is one of these projects that tries to sort of, get media organisations to show they're working a bit more. So we have to say who our shareholders are, we have to say what our policy on fact-checking is, we have to publish data on the ethnic and gender diversity of our staff, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you wanted to, if you were InfoWars, you could try and participate in this, but you would have to publish who your shareholders were and what your fact-checking policy was, which they might find slightly problematic. So there isn't a normative judgment being made by the Trust Project about whether you can trust this organisation. It's just sort of saying, well, if they're prepared to put this information out in the public domain, they're probably more trustworthy than people who can't. And you know, there's that model. There's the NewsGuard model where they do make judgments and then people argue with those judgments. And then, of course, there's the sort of thing that Civil's trying to do. So I think essentially we're in a period where we're trying to find new mechanisms that can help us restore the trust that's been lost, in part because of these changes going on in the outside world, but also these changes going on with the medium that we're publishing in now, which means that the old trust mechanisms that we used to have are not as effective as they were. And over to you.
I should have said at the beginning as well, sadly, Vivian has a pre-arranged appointment and does have to leave a little bit early. So we're going to make sure she talks as much as she can in the next half an hour. The idea that all information is suspect, Vivian, that the way that we're sort of viewing things on the internet, that, as Tom was saying, sort of, you know, the platform has changed. Civil, obviously, is a real approach to try to change that. Tell us about what you've sort of found during your time, it's a year, isn't it, doing...
Just under a year.
Yeah, just under a year. Yeah. Sort of look at what you found and what can be done.
I will, and I'll just say that, you know, one of the great ironies that when we're talking about trust is, you know, in the early days of the internet, the idea, I mean, the conventional wisdom was the internet would be the great democratizer of information and will lead to a flowering of trust because everybody can be in conversation, and that it would bring out people's better angels. And make trust that much more tactile. Of course, we know that the complete opposite, I know it's laughable at this point, we now know all about those better angels and how scarce they are, sadly. And also, sadly, trust is at an all-time low, as measured by organizations like the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, trust in media. So there are many efforts to try to get at ways to help with the trust crisis. The Trust Project, Sally Lehrman is here, is one of them. NewsGuard, again, takes a very different tack. We're doing, there's a third one before I talk about Civil that everybody should know about, because I'm a little bit of a student of these efforts because it's important and interesting and wonderful that there are so many. There's another one called the Journalism Trust Initiative, which is a consortium of groups, but it's led by RSF, Reporters Sans Frontières, and it is, sorry, my French pronunciation is terrible, I realize, and it's a consortium of organizations in Europe. It is intended to be global, and similar to the Trust Project, it's looking at criteria, not to pick winners and losers, but to say, really, you know, buyer beware, in a sense, as a reader, so that all of those criteria can be known and visible to the public. What we're doing at Civil is something a little bit different. So Civil is a network of news organizations around the world, and who have only one thing in common. There's only one thing that a news organization needs to do to be part of Civil, which is they need to meet a criteria that we lay out in something that we call very grandly the Civil Constitution, which is online and visible for anyone to see. Probably, since this is a room full of journalists, anybody that would read that Civil Constitution would be not surprised by one word in it. It's pretty garden variety standards, practices, and ethics. And yet, one of the challenges we have today is people don't, particularly with so many new news organizations coming online, you have everything from just incredible new journalistic enterprises coming online. Just yesterday, The City launched in New York, which is sort of shockingly a news desert for local news, and is doing extraordinary work. And yet, at the same time, we know there are all these, you know, phony, baloney news organizations or so-called news organizations come online. How are people to know? So, the idea with Civil is any news organization can join. It is a network that is owned by no one. It is governed. It is governed and managed cooperatively just by journalists and the public they serve. And I won't go into chapter and verse about how it works. We're doing a blockchain panel on Saturday. I'd encourage you to come. But the interesting thing is it's the people who are on the platform that will make the judgments broadly, collectively, over whether an individual news organization is in violation of provisions of that Constitution or not. We've really only just launched in the first few weeks, and we have many really extraordinary newsrooms that are already part of it. But interestingly enough, we've already had our first challenge. So the way that it works is if somebody feels that a news organization is in violation of provisions of the Constitution, they can challenge that news organization by staking and again, I'm not going to go into detail on this. I will on Saturday. It's a blockchain-based platform. So we have these cryptocurrency called a civil token that's a governance mechanism. If you don't understand what I'm talking about, don't worry, but we can talk about it another time. But by challenging, it's your voting mechanism and your share of ownership of the platform. So you can challenge a news organization if they don't, by citing, saying they don't meet this part of the Constitution. We've already had our first challenge. You can see it online if you go to civil.co, and I'll show you where to click, for a news organization that is being challenged because it is not, for a couple of reasons. I think it's because they're not disclosing some branded content. So we will begin to see how this, and then people can vote with the challenger or against it. So we'll begin to see this in action. And as the network grows with more and more news organization and more members of the public, it could be quite an interesting experiment.
Traditionally, the news organisations have not coped well with that sort of challenge.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about the British press, which obviously I've known better as sort of covering media for The Guardian. The idea of sort of, you know, people wrote in and said, can it be possible that you've got something wrong? That seems so old as to be hardly believable that that could be during your working life.
You're sure you've got something right.
Exactly.
Does that, how does it work? Is that the culture where, you know, as you say, those sort of halcyon days where the wisdom of crowds and this fabulous thing, the internet, was going to mean that all these experts were out there and could tell journalists, that sort of backfired because it became quite toxic quite quickly. Do you ever see a point where the sort of there will be a conversation again between news organisation and audience that is anything other than
toxic?
Yeah.
Yeah, who's doing this well?
Yeah. Well, we're a grand experiment. We're just starting out. That's our hope and our goal, and we'll see. And I didn't explain all the details of civil and how it works and how people are incentivized or disincentivized to incentivized to be good actors and not bad actors. But yeah, this is the challenge. I mean, this is our dream, right? Where the early vision of the internet, where there can actually be, civil conversations in the public sphere, debating issues in a respectful way, is still. I really don't want to give up on that. I know that sounds incredibly naive, but I would love to find. I would like to hope that there is still a way.
But can you name people where you feel it's actually, as Tom said, that?
Yeah, exactly. Where do you think
we've
done experiments with like Facebook groups, and when you have a Facebook group and you have a but it's not just the moderator. You have a sort of terms of engagement, and people, when they join the group, they have to agree that they'll abide by the rules of like being civil and so on and so on. Occasionally, they step over the line, and then you call them on it and say, "Look, you said when you joined this group," and the quality of debate in that group is much higher, but it's a much smaller group. So and it's not public, and so it's all slightly. I don't know. What are the other models, and who else is doing this well? No, come on, you must.
I could nominate one if you like, which is, notwithstanding the fact that I can see various of my former colleagues who were responsible for it in the audience, my old employers did actually do rather a good job of it relative to others in terms of fostering a reasonably healthy discussion below the line, which was a very exciting.
But does that lead to the issue of subscription?
But
if you close the garden, you allow only certain people?
Well, there are two parts to that. The first was that even though first of all, yes, you do limit the number of people who can take part. Secondly, I found over the years that I was trying to talk back to my beloved readers, all of whom thought it was worth paying the considerable sum needed to subscribe to the FT. I had a very clear strategy in mind. I often used them to actually research information. As time went by, the tide of anger in the internet slowly rose and eventually more or less engulfed me. I had typical standards that I would, or strategies to use, such as actually being polite to people, always replying, asking if they really meant to be that strong. Are you sure that language is justified? Which worked beautifully for several years and no longer does, or that's what I find, is that it still doesn't work. That said, for a long period of time, we did manage to get people to to treat comments below the line and other means of communication with us as not just a wall to be graffitied on, which I think a lot of people now regard a comment section as a wall to be graffitied on. I was at a panel, one of the panels I went to this morning, the guy from crowdreporter.de said that if you put a comment section like there, you're basically putting a fighting cage there for people. You're inviting them to have a UFC-style fight. But anyway, if you do want to, intriguingly, I discover, having moved elsewhere, that if you do want to look at the Financial Times model, it does actually work surprisingly well. There is
something that one of the facts that shocked me. It shouldn't have, and now we are going to have to mention the Brexit word. But you tweeted, you were in New York, June 23rd. The vote had come in, and John, literally the morning after, put a picture of the sterling. What had happened to sterling overnight? It went back how many years? It
went back 45 years.
So it's a 45-year graph of sterling. And it literally showed that the Brexit vote had led to sterling to crash. And he just did, good morning, Britain, this is what's happened to your currency overnight. That was it.
Yep.
But all the responses, practically, the huge amount of response was, how dare you, you're just a Romania, this is all just a lie. And it was simply a chart. And if you have people saying that a chart of a currency movement is a lie...
Yes. Sourced to Bloomberg as well, so that's both both my present and former employers were distrusted in that instance.
Have we got... I suppose you could argue you could have taken it from 2 days or something, but is there a point where the game's up?
Yeah. Well,
that was one of my points of thinking that it was. Yes. Yeah.
No. Well, this is what you are. This is the distillation of the crisis, the global crisis we're in, which is the notion that of independent facts, evidence-based information, upon which then opinions are formed. People come to different conclusions, take different sides. We at least, I think, had that foundation. That foundation of facts is now eroding. Yeah. Thanks in part to people like, and I know we now that Brexit's been brought up, I can talk about Trump. Thanks to people like Trump, who then question whether information before our very eyes is real. And of course, this is a tactic of a favorite tactic of dictators, which is, or people that would choose to never be questioned, which is, don't believe what you see, just listen to me, I'll tell you the truth. So the notion of an objective chart that shows the decline of what's happened with sterling, all of a sudden is suspect and is related to somebody's point of view as opposed to being an objective truth. This is to me, this is the foundation of the crisis that we're in.
Yeah.
And that's the worry. Belief in the concept of truth.
Correct.
Almost, and that feels facts. Like a genie's come out, which is so impossible to argue with. Or is that just too nihilistic? That actually human nature cannot surely be that insistent on a version of truth.
It's tribal. People are. I think we are reverting to sort of a tribalism where each tribe is going to have its own set of truth that they rally around. It's not good.
But I suppose using the issue of subscription, I've sort of noted how many. I was thinking of Tortoise in the UK, for example. Many of these new ventures that are happening, that are getting financial backing for, are subscription. They're not open. They're not open web anymore. That sort of reach, and of course at the same time, the BuzzFeeds and Vice, the sort of big groups that went for reach, are struggling financially. If not as much as sort of the mainstream media, the more established print operations. It's a new world. Is that sort of the open web and trying to deal with the issue of trust in that? Does that have to go because the tribalism is too great?
Well, I think some of that has to do with financial models. A lot of that just have to do with revenue miles and declining revenue streams that perhaps at one time were rewarding scale and are now rewarding more sort of loyalty and engagement. So I'm not sure that's entirely about trust, but it does coincide with that in the sense of, we can all be, it does coincide with this tribalism and people picking publications that they feel represent their worldview, and then they choose to be members of. So
Yeah.
I mean,
Tom at The Economist, at the same time, it has become this sort of, we don't believe in experts anymore. Nobody knows what they're talking about, so that whether you have a chart or you have facts about economics, and I know it's only 10%, but even political economy, is that sort of something that you've noticed, even with the sort of, your audience that is, if not specialist?
There are still some people out there who do want to pay for high quality journalism. There has been a general rebellion against listening to experts. That's certainly true. I think those sorts of things ebb and flow. But yeah, I mean, what I would say is that it's not as simple as you don't have to have a model where only the subscribers see the content. You can still have a metered paywall system where other people can still see it if they're not subscribers. So it's not a kind of all or nothing. But I can see that moving towards no comments or moving towards subscriber-only comments is a way of trying to improve the quality of the discourse. And another thing that people have classically said about this is the adult in the room effect. So if an early comment is from from one of the staff of ideally the author of the piece, that very much sets the tone for how people subsequently respond, because they feel that there's an adult in the room.
Do you insist on that, The Economist? Because I think at the beginning, definitely The Guardian did.
That was very much a Guardian. So the Guardian and Indeed site kind of pointed this out earliest, I think. We've actually had comments turned off on most of our output for technical reasons, which is that we're changing our CMS, and the old CMS is just absolutely, we've got bots posting nonsense all over it, and we don't want to invest any more resources in basically fixing a system that we're about to switch off. So we've ended up turning off comments on nearly everything, and there are a few areas where we have a space on the site called Open Future where we encourage debate, and so comments still switched on there, and that means we have a smaller number of comments to moderate, and I think that in turn means that we do get a better quality of debate, because we are able to devote more resources to actually keeping an eye on.
And you'll stick to that system even with a new CMS?
I don't know. I'm not sure that I don't think we've made a decision yet. The new CMS will go in, and we've been looking at different commenting platforms, and I think there's generally there's an active debate about what the right way to.
But I mean, The Guardian did start it, and I was women's editor for 4 years at the height, where I was encouraged every time we did a blog to go in and sort of try to make the debate not say, where are the men? But actually, you can't do that, because that takes up more time than any of the original writing. And now, I mean, even at The Guardian, they turn comments off far more stories than they ever did, to try to manage. It has to be a manageable process.
Yep. And it's not and it's the bots as well. I mean, the bots, just posting spam and all the rest of it, it makes it much, much harder to stay on top of it, and just reduces the quality. It just ends up being this graffiti wall.
Although given that we're talking about audience participation and asking comments, I know there are some people in the audience who have very much been involved, I know with The Guardian and possibly the FT as well, with their own comments and moderation. But ask some questions. I don't know, the people talking at the back.
Yes.
I know that you're...
The AV crew, I know you don't think we can hear you, but the acoustics of this room means... I can hear.
You can't even. So,
hear the back
excuse
of
me,
can hear each other.
chap at the back.
Like
I thought you were doing. I thought you were doing translation. Can you please try not to talk for the rest of this session? It's really hard not to be distracted.
We can hear every word.
By everything you're saying.
It's weird. It's like the Whispering Gallery.
I don't think that's made any difference, but anyway, I had to go. Right. So sorry. There's a question here and then here.
Hello, I'm Madeleine Stottmeyer from the Austrian press agency, and I'm a finance journalist. So the stock market I cover is a tiny bit smaller than John's. And I was wondering, in my eyes, I feel like the narrative of now 2 years we have certain people in power explaining, this is not true what journalists write, this is, fake. This kind of narrative has been adopted by companies when we report on certain numbers or on certain other events. Just Wirecard, for example, with the dispute. I was wondering about your experiences towards that and how you deal with it. Are you calling upon that companies use more defense mechanism or defense policies when it comes to their press? Or have you surveyed something similar? I mean, because in my eyes, it has been a little bit dramatic in the last couple years.
Sorry, not you, obviously.
John, what's your take on this? Because I think companies have always, some of them have always had big PR operations who ring up and say, this is absolutely terrible, and everything's completely wrong, and you say exactly what is wrong, and they can't tell you. But have you seen this?
Yeah. It's, no, the ability to really directly brazen out and deny rather than not comment has increased quite significantly. The ability to fight fire with fire by attacking the messenger has increased. One point, I was talking to a colleague at Bloomberg about this the other, about this panel I was going to be on. One point that's also interesting, which we should note, is that the trust is diminishing in both ways. So news organizations are now in the point where we can't necessarily take a denial as a denial. And if you want the very big example, there was a Business Week scoop about Apple devices going out with snooping gear on it, in broad terms. If you look in the piece, you'll see there is a flat denial of all the other facts in the piece attributed to Tim Cook. And yet the decision was made to publish it, which means implicitly that the possibility is very real in the minds of the editors that Tim Cook, possibly the most respected CEO out there at the moment, is lying.
Yeah, or your story could be wrong.
Yes, well,
an awful lot of people
plainly
think it is.
Plainly that's always the thing, but it's not as though a denial. It's not as though if somebody is prepared to say, no, this is not true, I'm prepared to say on the record, this isn't true. Normally, certainly both the FT or the Bloomberg, the ones that I can speak for, that would normally have been enough to say, okay, we're not running this, or we're not running the meat of it, or whatever. Nowadays, the trust in both directions is weakened to the extent that you will not take a denial, trust a denial on at its face value, which again begins to get very dangerous.
Before this session, we were talking, I'm sorry that Vivian's had to go, about whether it's more important for some areas like finance and health that actually there is trust, that we do expect the people to, journalists writing about these things make a big impact on people's lives. Do you think that's true, both of you? I think
it's interesting that one area where we say that no one trusts experts anymore, and no one's interested in facts. But when you're in a car crash, you suddenly trust the experts in the hospital, so there are places where, and that's why anti-vax stuff is so crazy.
Well, I don't think anyone ever said, "Trust me, I'm a journalist."
Well, to respond to that, there is a sense in which what journalism is, certainly journalism has never had the kind of trust that doctors have, and Columbia Journalism School may be very respected, but it doesn't produce people with the same absolutely emphatic badge of quality that Columbia Medical School does. That said, I do think that there is a way in which actual journalism is now regarded as suspect, that doing the job that used to be physically necessary because a news bulletin only lasted half an hour and a newspaper was only so many pages, of editing down, synthesizing, having a number of different people working out what the best thing was to do, and having the brand of this news organization giving you this imprimatur of trust. I think that is now almost regarded as less trustworthy than the new idea that everybody should let it fly, and you arrive at wisdom through the wisdom of crowds.
It's almost everybody's making things up.
The example I mentioned in my piece, for which I got deeply abused, was during the crisis I went to take money out of a bank, saw that there was a large queue of Wall Streeters at a Citibank and at a Chase next door. This was right in the main financial district of New York in one of the very worst days of the crisis. And it occurred to me after the event that once I got back to the office, I suppose I could just send a photographer down there and take a photo of, look, here are Wall Streeters doing a bank run. And we didn't do that because, you know, bank runs can be a self-perpetuating, self-fulfilling prophecy. If you get people scared, then they will take money out of the bank, and then there will indeed be a bank run. And indeed, it turns out there wasn't actually a big run on consumer deposits in the big banks in New York, just this localized phenomenon that I'd seen. So we didn't run it. We did run a terrifying apocalyptic headline anyway about credit panic at historic levels or whatever. And the amount of abuse I got, nobody thought, the number of people who thought I was just not entitled to self-censor, not entitled to decide this wasn't clear enough that what was going on, that it would be irresponsible to give the impression that there was a bank run going on without far more reporting. At this point, if that were to happen today, somebody would have a camera phone, they'd photograph it, they'd tweet it, and maybe it would go viral, or maybe it wouldn't.
Would you do it differently today, if it happened now?
It's quite possible, given how much I tweet and given how important Twitter followers and all the rest of it are to a brand of Economist, it's conceivable I would.
Well, anyone from the UK, Robert Peston is exactly what happened with Northern Rock, where he did the pictures, the BBC, the pictures of a bank with people queuing up to get their money out. I know, so James is going to ask, I know you've been waiting very patiently, sorry. So you and then James.
Hello, my name is Dubriana and I'm a business journalist in London. With the rise of deep fake news and voices and CGI'd videos that look and sound authentic but actually aren't, what's your strategy to deal with those?
Well, I think it's the same. I mean, there's that. Who's seen the video that's been going around this week of the Amazon blimp, the airship with all the little drones that come out of it? It's an amazing, amazing video, and it just kind of looks like Jeff Bezos is coming and he's going to take over the world with this amazing blimp. And it turns out it's CGI, and so there was this kind of big argument between the people who were sharing it on Twitter going, oh my God, it's so scary, and the other people saying, you should only be sharing this video if you say it's fake. I mean, I don't think we base, you know, we're not a TV station, so we don't base news reports around video. It tends not to be how we do it. And this is a very active area of research, and in fact the previous session was on this, about, on the one hand you've got systems like generative adversarial networks that can generate extremely convincing fake video. They're not so good at the fake speech yet. They're getting a bit better, but and it's still a bit, you know. And when they generate the fake video, people aren't blinking enough, and so there's still ways you can catch them out. But there's clearly an arms race going on there, and I think it just is going to be an extension of all of the sort of traditional wherewithal of fact checking. So for news organisations that have fact checking, I mean, we found that our research department, we fact check things, and we have to have more people, and they have to spend longer doing it, just because there are more places you can look things up now. So, you know, back in the 70s, when all you had was some encyclopedias and some, you know, some annual reports and things like that, you couldn't actually check every fact in every piece. But now you can check a lot more things. So I think that is going to put more onus on fact checking within organisations, and also these sort of, you know, distributed fact checking, third-party fact-checking organisations. And this is one of the things that contributes to it. Trump can say with the Access Hollywood tape, first when it comes out, he says, well, so what if I said it? 2 years later, he's saying it's fake because someone's told him that you can now fake audio, and so he can deny that, and that's sort of plausible to some people. So yeah, it's frightening, but it does mean that there's just going to be even more, you know, onus on finding ways to fact check, and fact checking becomes more. I mean, we have this with, you know, videos. When you see a video of a demonstration in the Middle East, and people say this is today in Syria, and someone says actually the dialect of Arabic is wrong, and you know, you have specialist fact checkers who are good at spotting those sorts of things, and we're just going to need more people like that.
The Economist, however, does have an amazing film in it, which Tom is also responsible for, which has just done a fabulous video of the Masters in Financial Journalism at City University, which is entirely real and very unfake, which I'd advise you all to watch and share. James.
So, hey, James Ball, journalist. I'm desperately tempted to get into the Business Week story, but I will resist that and ask about... The sort of title of the panel is quite intriguing because it's Finance and the Media, Why No One Trusts Either. And does that imply that the media, the financial media at least, has some sort of responsibility to keep trust in the financial system, given its role in society? You know, do you see it that way? Is it your job to restore trust in it, to make us less trustful of it, given that, you know, as you were saying, I mean, we know about the financial crash. We know there's been quite serious wrongdoing and deception from a lot of companies. Or is it not your problem either way, and you just sit and report and do your thing? Because I think, you know, the question is raised somewhat by the title and
John, I mean, the piece John wrote was, and your anecdote. I mean, do you think, you know, to James's question, it is the role of the media to?
I think it probably is the role of the financial media to ensure that the financial sector deserves to be trusted. I.e., it's our role to call it out when it does stuff that doesn't deserve to be trusted, and therefore, if we do our job properly, we call out the bad elements before they get too bad, and we leave ourselves with a system that actually works. I think what we do have is somewhat of a negative or a vicious circle where nobody much trusts either the media or the financial sector and regards both as being complicit in the other at present. That was a widespread response to why I didn't write about the bank run, was that I was protecting my friends, the bankers, which was just not... if a bank run happens, depositors lose money. And if again, thinking of the example of Robert Peston, the idea of creating the situation where it would cause lots of people to lose their deposits, and if a very big bank crashes, an economic crash, that's something I wasn't entitled to do. That being said, the point there is you're saying it has the effect, irrespective of whether it's true. If I was absolutely confident that there was already a run on deposits that was significant, you have to spend a lot of time being absolutely sure you're right before you say something like that, but then I probably would have done so.
I suppose there's also a sort of a secondary part to that as well, that the criticism of sort of financial journalists becoming too close to the establishment of finance, the markets that they report on. I suppose with any specialist media, but because finance is so powerful, there have been more criticisms. Do you think that's fair? Or do you think it's just all wrapped up with part of the general mudslinging?
I think you've probably got to be even more careful about the joys of access in financial journalism than in other journalism, yes.
I think it's worth pointing out that there are two industries who have disproportionate amounts of money to spend on PR, and they are tech and finance.
Yeah.
And they, you know, the number of PR people in those industries, you know, it's something ridiculous, like 10 times as many as the number of journalists. And so, yeah, there is an imbalance there, but there's also, it shows you the amount of resources that those industries are prepared to put into controlling or trying to influence the coverage that they get. And there is a reason for that. So, yeah, I think that makes it, I mean, here we are, this panel I think is sponsored in some way by Facebook, or they're sponsoring this room. So in between these sessions where people are generally quite rude about Facebook, we have to watch adverts about how lovely and wonderful Facebook is. So, you know, this is the nature of how this game is played, and you know,
no Facebook ads.
Not letting that get into your coverage is, you know, is a constant struggle.
So Dennis Redman, I teach international media at the School of Journalism here in Perugia. I wanted to know, you spoke about the loss of tombstones and stock prices as a revenue source. So what are the new streams of revenue which are coming in? I mean, you can't just make money on a FT wine club. You can try and change the model like the New York Times and go 60-40, 40-60 regarding advertising.
Well, the FT went... Yeah, is a much more extreme version of the New York Times.
The FT crossed over before the New York Times,
yes.
In terms of...
Yes.
The New York Times followed...
What are the news? What are those news streams? And also, in regard to the last question, since PR has a lot of money to extend on this, what are the new pressures or is it more of the same
so
old?
something we haven't mentioned is this whole kind of pay-for-play sponsored content or sponsor content and sort of supplements. And obviously one of the things that a lot of news organizations have done, which has undermined their credibility, is they'll take heaps of money from some dodgy country to publish a wonderful supplement about how great that country is and how everyone should invest there or go on holiday there or whatever. And that certainly doesn't help. And it's one of the ways that the business model crisis that a lot of publishers have connects with the crisis in trust. But those of us sitting here are in an unusual position because The Economist, the FT, and Bloomberg are, news organizations with profitable subscriber-based models. And I remember someone who worked at Quartz telling me that they all used to joke about one day when we were all working for Bloomberg, because they assumed that Bloomberg and other organizations like that would mop up all of the new free ad-supported publishers, and obviously there is a roll-up happening there. But I think if you look at what Bloomberg, the FT, and the Economist have done, we have just kind of gone back to, or in fact, we never really stepped away from the subscriber-based model. I mean, we were more profitable when there was lots of ad money around, but ultimately, in our case, certainly, half of our money always came from subscribers, and now we're back to kind of 85% of our money coming from subscribers. So I'm not sure there are new streams like wine clubs and so on. I think the get your readers to pay you for the journalism is the tried and trusted model that we're sticking with.
It's a huge shift, though, 50% to 85% subscribers.
Well, we went up to 50. That was at the peak of the dot-com boom. So most of our revenue for most of our existence has come from subscribers. It's just while there was a lot of easy money to be made from adding ad pages. I mean, The Economist was like twice as thick in the year 2000. We were very happy to take the money. At the time, we basically broke even on circulation, and then the profits came from advertising. And what we've done since then is we've essentially increased the profitability of our circulation by reducing the number of people on discounts and so on. We've held the circulation steady and essentially just massively increased the profitability of circulation. So
I don't think that certainly that isn't particularly true of the FT. I think the FT we still had. I think subscription only overtook advertising within the last 10 years. I want to think.
Was that for the first time though?
I think so. The advertising was always. I mean, the Sun is more like something like 90% cover price.
Yeah,
the FT is very much more. I'm not sure it was as much as 90% advertising, but it was majority advertising until really the FT is over 100 years old. It's only in the last decade or so that those lines have crossed.
And where, of course, people
but also 50% isn't very much. The peak in the US in 2008 was 87% of the average US newspaper's revenue came from advertising. And of course, it was 100% in some cases with free newspapers. So that was the challenge.
And no, even sort of Guardian, which hasn't done subscription, the membership model, and other organisations that are doing membership as well as sponsored content, the revenue streams are having to diversify. I think they're all waving at us. So unless there's anyone with a burning question, I suppose the final thing I would just ask: do you think things like the Trust Project, Civil, these organisations that are sort of set up to try to make it better, are they going to make a difference? Just one word answer, yes or no. Is it going to get better?
I hope so.
No.
Okay.
I say let 1,000 efforts like this bloom. We'll try all of them.
That's what we said about the internet.
It's worth trying. But
the old mechanisms broke. We need new ones.
Yeah. All right. On that cheery note, I'd like to raise a hand, please, for my fabulous panel: John Authers, Tom Standage, and the departed Vivian Schiller. I wanted to stomp over there.
I actually stopped when I stopped in my first.
No, I thought it was them at the there because you could hear them.
I wondered whether it was translation, but it wasn't.